Greetings to you. This is Jerry Thomas from Sakshi Apologetics Network. Along with the Chattambi Swamigal series, we are starting a three small episodes, a new series on the question, was India a rich country before the British colonialism, and is India poorer because of the British colonialism? Now, I have heard this argument from many quarters, including the Honorable MP of Thiruvananthapuram, Shashi Tharoor. And the reason why we are looking at it is, it implies that India had better institutions, better religious values, and better political systems before the British came into India. The reason I am saying is, economic development of a country is always dependent on the religious, political, and social institutions of that society. This was pointed out by none other than Mahadeva Govinda Ranade, or popularly known as Justice Ranade. Justice Ranade is considered as the father of the Indian economics, and he was also the co-founder of the Indian National Congress. As an economics professor, as the father of the Indian economics, he had the deep understanding how the economy works. In his book, The Religious and Social Reform, a collection of essays and speeches by Mahadeva Govinda Ranade, in the introduction, he says this: you cannot have a good social system when you find yourself low in the scale of political rights, nor can you be fit to exercise political rights and privileges unless your social system is based on reason and justice. You cannot have a good economical system when your social arrangements are imperfect. And if your religious ideals are low and groveling, you cannot succeed in social, economical, or political spheres. Now, Justice Ranade, unlike the other congressmen at that time who accused Britishers of draining the India's wealth, he had the deep understanding, and we will look at more of his quotations later. But the theory that he says, or the proposition that he presents to us, that you need to have a good religious values, you need to have good social and political systems to have economically progress, is undoubtedly true. He goes on to say, this interdependence is not an accident, but it is the law of the nature. And he says, it is a mistaken view which diverses the consideration of political from social and economical, and no man can be said to realize his duty in one aspect who neglects his duty in the other directions. What Justice Ranade said is now considered as the cultural theory or religious theory of the economics. And now this was popularized by none other than Max Weber. Max Weber, on his own studies, he spoke about the Protestant ethics and the capitalism, where he says that the certain values have contributed to the progress of the country. And when they are speaking, they are not merely speaking the religious values as one or the sole cause. As Justice Ranade said, you need to have good social system, you need to have political rights, you need to have good systems in all the other aspects for you to progress. Religion provides you the values. You also need to have the other institutions to progress. If India was a rich country before the British colonialism, it implies that India had better institutions, better religious values, and better political systems before the Britishers came. And those who hear me will know that that was certainly false. So where does Shashi Tharoor and Raj Vedam, people like Raj Vedam, get their arguments? Let us hear the clip. First from Raj Vedam of the Sangham Talks, then by Shashi Tharoor.
The Vedic system, the caste system, kept the lower classes in their positions without giving them access to studies and other such things, and that accounts for widespread poverty in India. So that is what Marxists would like you to believe, and that's what is being pushed in the textbooks. Like to see what will happen. Angus, Madison, historical economist, talks about the GDP of India at 33% as the world GDP in one, going down to 2003, up to 2003. You see it's going through a period of decline over here through invasion periods, a small rise during Maratha consolidation, and then the colonialist and a rapid decline fortunes of India when Western Europe goes up. The idea from a mile-high view is that a transference of wealth from India into Western Europe caused poverty in India. However, this is hiding a lot of things. There are maybe 100 PhD theses waiting to be written over here about the micro stories. There are lots of human interest, bottom level stories that is not told by this graph. Everything is embedded over here.
As you have heard from Raj Vedam, he connects the Vedic system to the economic progress. And he would be obviously right if India was much richer, if the Indians were much richer and Indians were wealthy and they were much better off earlier, then the Vedic system should take the credit. And we will now listen to Shashi Tharoor as well.
Touch on that. But this is almost like the American saying to the widow of the American president, apart from that, Mrs. Lincoln, how did you enjoy the play? I mean, you know, really, the British came to one of the richest countries in the world, accounting for 27% of global GDP in 1700, 23% in 1800, and over 200 years of exploitation, depredation, loot and destruction, reduced it to a poster child for third world poverty, just over 3% of global GDP, 90% of the population living below the poverty line when the British left in 1947.
As you have heard Shashi Tharoor, he makes the claim that India was a very rich country, became a poor country or a poster boy of third world because of the British's rule, or the British drained the wealth from India. This he repeats in his book, An Era of Darkness, the British Empire in India. We will look at the quote, but before we look at the quote, there are majorly 3 or 4 arguments people like Shashi Tharoor or Raj Vedam would give us. One was the decline in the GDP contribution to the world GDP. Second, they argue that was a wealth drain from India to the Europe, and the wealth drain, they will the figures will change from 1,000 million pound to 40 million pound, depending upon how you calculate it. And third, they will say there was a deindustrialization. This is a very important argument. They say that India had huge industries, textile industry was the biggest, and because of the British rule, there was a deindustrialization. And then there is a fourth minor argument. Because of the bad administration of the Britishers, there were many famines in India. What we will do is, we will look at the GDP argument in this episode, and we will look at the deindustrialization argument in the next episode. And the third episode, we will look at the argument that there was a wealth drain. And in the third episode, finally, we will look the famine, what caused the famines in India. The fourth argument, we are not considering as a fourth episode. We will club it with the third episode. So let us begin by looking at the GDP argument. And as I said in the book, An Era of Darkness, the British Empire in India, Shashi Tharoor repeats what he spoke. He says, at the beginning of the 18th century, as the British economic historian Angus Madison has demonstrated, India's share of the world economy was 23%, as large as all of the Europe put together. It had been 27% in 1700, when the Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb treasury raked in 100 million pound in tax revenues alone. By the time British departed India, it dropped to just over 3%. The reason was simple. India was governed for the benefit of Britain. Britain's rise for 200 years was financed by its depredations in India. So Shashi Tharoor makes a direct connection between India's GDP contribution getting decreased and Europe becoming progress, specifically the England becoming a progress country. Let us look at the same book where Shashi Tharoor quote, Angus Madison's book, The World Economy, The Historical Statistics. What Raj Vedam and Shashi Tharoor quotes is from table 8b, share of world GDP, 20 countries and regional total from AD 1 to 2001. And this is in the page 261, table P. If you look at the Western Europe, total Western Europe's contribution was 21.9% in 1700 compared to 24.4% of India. Now you might think Shashi Tharoor is right. But let me caution, GDP is not like your body temperature or a room temperature. It is not a number that you get directly. It is a derivative number. It is a number derived from many other numbers. What are the many other numbers? It can be one of the numbers is the world's population contribution. If your population is huge, your GDP can be bigger than a region with a smaller population, though the region with a smaller population might be richer. For example, to illustrate that, there was a study. Let me give you a study. A study done by Society of Participatory Research in Asia and Indicus Analytics on the economic contribution of the urban poor in India. This was done in 2013, or the study came out in 2013. And the study says the slums in India, if you take the large slums in India, 6 or 7 slums in India, slums contribute over 7.5% to GDP. Now this number is huge. In order to understand it, take the handbook on statistics on Indian states from the RBI website. RBI gives on an annual basis. I am taking the latest which is available. It is of 2022. 2022, if you take and calculate the percentage of the GDP contribution of the top 15 states, whether it's Maharashtra, Tamil Nadu, Uttar Pradesh, Gujarat, Karnataka, West Bengal. Now this number is not accurate because the central's contribution also to be added, but I am not adding at this point. But even then, say for example, Gujarat has a contribution of 7.80% to the India's GDP. Slums contribute in 2013 7.5% to the India's GDP. So are we going to say slums are equally rich like the Gujarat? Of course not. Or take the example of Telangana. Telangana contributes 4.5%. Slums contribute 7.5%. Now the high-tech city in Hyderabad and all the other regions, their contribution to the India's GDP is much lower than the slums contribution. Are we going to say the slums are richer than the Telangana as a whole? Absolutely not. What happens here, the slums had a huge population compared to the states. We are taking 7 or 6 big slums in India like Dharavi, the slums in West Bengal. Put together, they are much, much bigger. So their contribution to the GDP can be higher. Was it the case when we say the India's GDP contribution was huge? Yes, that is one of the key reasons. Not the only reason, one of the reasons. This we can see from the same Angus Madison's book, The World Economy in the Historical Statistics. Earlier we looked at the table 8b. Now we will look at 8a. Same book, one table above. And when we look at 8a, the world's share of world population, Europe in 1700, because we took the number of 1700, Europe in 1700 had 13.5% of the world's population, compared to India, which had 27.3% of the share of the world's population. Remember, 13.5% of the world's population Europe had, but they contributed to 21.9%. 27% India had in the world's population, but they only contributed to 24.4%. There itself, we can understand it is India's population which made a difference, not Indians were richer. Now keep this in mind. This is only one of the reasons. If you look at the change in the population, you will also see that the China's population was increasing and India's population was decreasing. That is one of the reasons, not the main reason. That is one of the reasons for India's GDP to decrease. There are other reasons, more stronger reasons. We will look at that. What are those reasons? Professor Trithakar Roy, he is the professor of economic history in the London School of Economics. He has written a beautiful book, How British Rule Changed India's Economy, The Paradox of the Raj. In the introduction, he effectively refutes Shashi Tharoor's and Raj Vedam's argument. He says, for example, the statistics that India produced 25% of world output in 1800 and 2 to 4% of it in 1900 does not prove that India was once rich and later became poor. It tells us nothing about India. It only tells us that the industrial productivity in the West increased 4 to 6 times during this period. In other words, West became more technologically advanced and therefore they progressed at a faster rate. For us to understand it easily, let us imagine that we were all in the generation of Dhirubhai Ambani. And 10 of us, along with Dhirubhai Ambani, were sitting together in 1950s. This is an imaginary story. And at that time, we all put our income together. And if we divide it by 10, I contributed 10% and Dhirubhai Ambani, who was an ordinary person at that time, also contributed 10%. Imagine Dhirubhai Ambani started his business and Dhirubhai Ambani became richer and richer and richer. And in the 2000, again 10 of us got together. And now we all put our incomes together. Dhirubhai Ambani's income now is almost 99% of our total income. Should I say Dhirubhai Ambani became rich because he took money from us, or we became poorer? Nothing. It just means Dhirubhai Ambani started a business and he became richer, whereas we all continued to be a normal middle class people. So that is why Professor Roy says here, India's contribution to world GDP decreasing doesn't say anything about India. She speaks that the West had progressed much more in advance. Now, Shashi Tharoor might argue that it is because of the well-trained, that we will look at later. But let us look at this argument again. GDP per capita is a better indicator. GDP per capita would be an average of the GDP by the population. Now, again, that is not a perfect indicator. To give an illustration, as I said, if 10 of us were sitting together and if Mukesh Ambani is sitting us with now, Mukesh Ambani, because he is a multi-billionaire, if we divide Mukesh Ambani, put all our income together and divide it by 10, we all become billionaires. It is not because I am a billionaire, it is because the average, one of us is a multi-billionaire and therefore others' income also looks up. But this is for a large country, this is a better indicator because we are speaking about a huge population. Now let us look at what is the GDP per capita when Shashi Tharoor and others speaks. And again, this statistics is given in the same book of the Angus Madison, The World Economy, Historical Statistics, Table 8C. Table 8A is the world's population. Table 8B, we saw the GDP, and we also have the GDP growth rate at Table 8B, which we will look at later. Now in Table 8C, we have the world per capita GDP. So what was the per capita GDP of Western Europe at the 1700? It is close to $1,000. What was the GDP per capita of India in 1700? It is 550. Now note, this is the first statistics given by Angus Madison. This was later revised. We will look at the revision later. Now, even if you look at the first statistics produced by Angus Madison, an average European is double richer than an average Indian. Average, if you take. The average income of the European was double than the average income of an Indian. So at no point in the last 1,000 years, India was richer than the Europe. We have to keep that in mind. What Shashi Tharoor is doing is a complete misrepresentation. Raj Vedam's intentions are very clear to us, but we are not clear why Shashi Tharoor is speaking like this. Again, as I said, this GDP per capita and all was the initial statistics of Angus Madison. Angus Madison's project, Madison Project, Collaborative Research on the Historical National Accounts, published in the Economic History Review, August 2014. The authors say that Angus Madison had an intention to bring all the data together. He knew that he was not the specialist of all regions, but he thought that whatever data he has, if he brings it and publish it, what will happen is the specialist in those regions will look at the numbers and will critique it. They will say, no, you have not included this, you are not calculated it rightly, this should be the final the GDP of that region. Angus Madison's intention was to initiate that, and he succeeded in that. When he published the book, the specialists in each region, the economic historians of each region looked at the statistics, and what has happened is the European GDP per capita was revised up, whereas India's GDP per capita remained the same. Now, if you look at the statistics, again the revised statistics, you will see at the US dollar, all those things are considered in the currency. In the 1500, if the India's GDP per capita was 550, it remained the same. But Europe's per capita income from 771, we earlier looked at 1700, but Europe's per capita income would have risen to 1200 or 1255. Now, the revised statistics, along with the change the US dollars, are given in the source, the Northern Italy and the Millennia Long Decline. The book, that is the Madison Project itself, this statistics, revised statistics is given. So when we look at the 1700, Western Europe at that time had 1,312 as the GDP per capita, whereas India's was 729. And if you look at England, 1700, note, 1700 England was 1540, more than double of the India. And how can Shashi Tharoor say that England became richer at the cost of India? They were already richer, double richer, even if you go by the GDP per capita. Why it remained? Why was it so? As I quoted Professor Roy, as he rightly pointed out, they became a technologically advanced society much before us. Now, this is agreed by most of the other economic historians as well. David Sol Landis, he was the college professor of history and professor of economics at the Harvard University. He wrote a book, The Wealth and Poverty of the Nations, examining why different countries were historically richer or historically poorer. And he says this about the Europe. Europe of the Middle Ages was one of the most inventive societies that history had known. Some may be surprised. For a long time, one saw these centuries as a dark interlude between the grandeur of Rome and the brilliance of Renaissance. That cliche no longer holds in matters of technological. What he said, that the Europe of the medieval society, the medieval ages, was the most inventive society that the history had ever known. Why he says so? Joseph R. Strayer, who was the chair of the history at the history department at the Princeton University, and who was formerly the president of the American Historical Association. While reviewing Lyon White's book, Medieval Religion and Technology, he says this. This was published in the Technology and Culture Journal. He says, the extraordinary range of the technological innovations of the Western countries. All classes were affected by these changes. All classes, it is not a specific group. Better plows for the peasants, better weapons for the fighting men, better machinery for the textile workers, better ships and sales patterns for merchants and seamen, spectacles for elderly scholars, papers for notaries, clocks for astrologers, and perhaps for churchmen, and more power, wind and mortar wheels for everyone. Europe in the Middle Ages was completely affected by the technological advancement. And he goes on to say, by 1500, note this date, this is before Columbus set his the ship for sail, before they started journeying anywhere else in the world. By 1500, Western Europe was a technologically oriented society and no other was. Why so? Jean Gimbel, French historian and medievalist, he answers this in his book, The Medieval Machine, the Industrial Revolution of the Middle Ages, chapter 7. He says, the spirit of inventiveness that accompanied this outlook was only possible because medieval society believed in progress, a concept unknown to the medieval classical world. Medieval men refused to be tied down by the tradition. They believed in the concept of progress. They believed that you can progress further. Now, this might be a common sense for us, but it was unknown in the classical world. Classical world believed in Sanatana Dharma, Sanatana world. The world will forever, it will remain the same. Such a society will never think about progress. But a Judeo-Christian worldview, which says that you started your journey in the Garden of Eden, but then you have a new heaven and a new earth, and you end up in the New Jerusalem, a bigger city, much city, from a garden to a city. That's a progress. So a society that believes in the progress, a historical progress, will try to adapt. They will not be tied down by the tradition. But a society that believes in Sanatana will always speak about the grandeur of the past, and they will be tied down by the tradition. Even now that we can see that is happening in India. Europe broke from those shackles and progressed because of the Judeo-Christian view. I'm not going to delve into that. We have already done videos on that, but if anybody has any questions on that, we can take that as a separate episode, and if anybody challenges it, if the Hindutva scholars challenges it, we can debate with the Hindutva scholars as well. Now, this is why the GDP grew. Now, there is another table, as I said, in table 8b itself, the rate of the world of GDP growth, the rate at which the GDP grows. If you look at the Angus Madison book, The World Economy Historical Statistics, the same book that the Shashi Tharoor quotes or Raj Vedam quotes, you will see Europe in the initial first 1,000 years, AD 1 to 1000, they had not grown much, same like India. At that time, for the initial 500, 600 years, the pagans continued to dominate the Europe. Europe became a Christian place later, And then they, from 80,000 onwards, they started progressing. 80,000 to 1,500, if you look at the GDP growth rate, it's 0.29% in Europe, whereas it was 0.12% in India. India had only half of the growth rate of Europe. And Europe continued to progress. As you adopt the technology, you continue to progress. Whereas India's best progress, note this point, India's maximum growth rate was when Britishers ruled here, because they tried to bring the changes. And it is the same period, Shashi Tharoor having access to the same book, having access to the same table, intends to misrepresent the entire statistics. I do not know the intentions of the Honorable MP Shashi Tharoor. I can understand the intentions of Raj Vedam, but I cannot understand the intentions of Shashi Tharoor for misrepresenting this. Now, the only time when the GDP grew or declined was during the World War I and World War II, and the Spanish flu also at that time. If you look at that statistics from 1913 to 1950, both in Europe and in India, there was a decline. And decline we can easily understand because we just had a pandemic, COVID pandemic, and we saw all the world economic declining. Same thing happened at the time of the World War along with the Spanish flu. Otherwise, if you look at the period before that, India had much faster growth than any Vedic civilization or any Mughal empire. But as I said, why did India not grow? As the David Landers looked at Europe, he also looked at India. In the Wealth and Poverty of the Nations, Harvard University professor, formerly the Harvard University professor, David Landers says, for similar reasons, the peasants and indeed all the subjects, this is about India, had no reason to improve the land, holding it as he did it at the pressure of the ruler. In other words, if somebody became wealthier, the ruler can take away the wealth. There was no property rights. There was no right for the certain caste of the population to hold the wealth. If the others see it, they can take away the wealth. Then what is the motivation to increase your wealth? If others are taking it away, what is the motivation for you to increase it? There is absolutely no motivation. No motivation. That is what he says. No one cares to improve the ways or tools of production. And hence wrote Bernier, he is quoting another person, the appalling contrast between the opulent few and the impoverished many. India had a very few rich, very rich people, but the masses remained in abject poverty to this. Where did this value come from? This value came from the Dharma Shastra of the Hindus. This is what Raj Vedam hides it. India is poor because of this Dharma Shastra, because of this Varna system. This is one of two sides, one of the Dharma Shastras, Manusmriti 8:417. The Brahmana may confidently have recourse to seizing the goods of Shudra, as the latter has no property and his property is meant to be seized by the master. Medadi, in his commentary on Manusmriti, very clearly said, this is not the donation by Shudra to the Brahman or even the other people to the Brahman. The Brahman can take away the wealth. The others can, Savarnas, they can, the upper caste can take away the wealth. The upper three castes can take away the wealth. Not only the Shudras, if this was the case of the Shudras, remember how the situation of the Avarnas would have been at that time. Such a terrible system, how can it improve the lives of the people? It cannot. Remember, Hindutva in the past or Hindutva in the present or Hindutva in the future can never make India a developed country. What about the Mughal rule at that time? Did they change it? Absolutely not. They cared nothing about the poor people. Now the Muslim parties in India, the political parties in India often cite great magnanimity towards the poor and the poor people of India. But remember, this is all for the political purposes. During the Mughal time, in the present in the Indian history, social scientist Irfan Habib says, no sympathy is wasted on them in the Indo-Islamic text, or the Muslims never cared for the poor people of the country. In fact, they imposed the same rules what the Manusmriti imposed on the Chandalas. They imposed the same rules on the farmers, Jats and all. They imposed the same thing. Because the human value, the Muslims cannot think of humans as humans. They can only think of humans as Muslims and Kafirs. And Kafirs are worse than Chandalas or equivalent to Chandalas. That is what happened when the Mughal rulers ruled here. And this is the period that Shashi Tharoor praises the Aurangzeb rule. What can we say about him? Now, statistics alone, as Raj Vedam says, there are many micro stories in this. GDP per capita also, as we saw, cannot tell you the stories rightly. In the book Mismeasuring Our Lives, co-authored by Amartya Sen, they cite the example of America, for example. America from 1999 to 2008, even though the GDP per capita was going up, the reality on the ground was different. The average American's income did not rise. As I said, because of the inequality was increasing. So if you look at the India's previous history, we do not have that statistics, but what we have is the records from the travelers who came to India. And those are recorded, and those confirms that the Indian masses lived in abject poverty. For example, in the Cambridge Economic History of India, Volume 1, Chapter 15, this is co-authored again by Irfan Habib. He says that foreign travelers who visited India during the 16th and the 17th centuries present a picture of small group in the ruling class living a life of great ostentation and luxury in sharp contrast to the miserable condition of the masses, the peasants, the artisans, and the domestic attendants. And there are few indicators for that. In the same book, they continue. Abdul Fasal, the great historian of Akbar's reign, says that the common people of the Bengal had no clothes. Literally, they were naked. They had the minimal clothes just to cover up their shame. Otherwise, absolutely no clothes. Now, our Hindutva people are very good in twisting all this argument. They might say that this is because of the cultural and the climatic condition. So, in the same book, they say that taking into the climatic factors and social traditions, if you look at the clothing of the rich people, they are also belonging to the same climate and same cultural condition. They had better clothes. They had much richer clothes. How can that be? How can that be? And this definitely is an indicator of the economic condition of the people at that time. Now, not only the clothes, if you look at the houses, the huts made, whether it is in Bengal, they look at all the regions, Bengal, Assam, Gujarat, South India. The masses lived in a small one-room kind of hut. Small houses, whether we can call houses or not, I do not know, but small places where they stayed. And they stayed along with, as they point out, they sometimes stayed along with the goat or the cow in the same house. And in South India, for example, in the hut, you cannot even stand up. That height was not there. Such poverty they lived. And Shashi Tharoor goes around, Raj Vedam goes around, claiming that this was a time when the Indians lived richly. How can they say that? By misrepresenting the GDP statistics. Now, not only the travelers who came at that time, in the trading world of Asia and English East India Company, 1600 to 1700, Chapter 11, the company and the Indian textile industry, K.N. Chowdhury, in page 273 writes, at that time, when the company directors were writing to the Europe, they were comparing the salaries here and salaries in the Europe. They say a French average workman used to earn 6 times more than the Indian average workman in the industry. And industry level, we will look at the next episode. 6 times higher salary in those times. That was the situation of India at that time. Now you might ask, if GDP does not show, this is a basic question, if GDP does not show our well-being, why is the GDP measured? In GDP, a brief but affectionate history, Diana Cole writes about the GDP history, and she points out GDP was invented during the Second World War. And it was invented during the Second World War to know the capacity of a country to fight the war. As far as the original purpose of the GDP is concerned, it is still a good measuring. But to measure the well-being of its citizens, GDP is not, neither is GDP per capita. That is why we have the other indicators, and the other indicators does not present a rosy picture of India. As I said, this is the first episode, and we are only looking at the GDP in this episode. We will look at the deindustrialization argument and well-trained argument in the next 2 episodes. Thank you for listening to me, and God bless you all.